They chained her to a wagon wheel at sunrise, said it was lawful. A matter of debt and duty. But out here in Redemption Gulch, law and justice don't always ride the same trail. She was 17, fierce-eyed and bleeding stubborn, facing a wedding no one should be forced into. The townsfolk turned away. Even the sheriff kept his mouth shut. But a widowed drifter, just in town for coffee and nails, stopped walking. He didn't yell. He didn't ask permission. He just raised his rifle and shattered the chains. And that, friends, is where this story begins, not with a gunshot, but with the decision to stand between the innocent and the powerful. In the West, some men still carry honor like they carry iron quiet, heavy, and ready. What did you think of today's story? If it brought you any warmth or made you smile even for a second, drop a simple good in the comments below. Got your own thoughts or feelings? I'd love to hear them seriously. And hey, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It's free, and it truly helps us grow this space for stories that matter. Thanks so much for being here. The wind, a bitter harbinger of a late Arizona autumn, snaked through the desolate main street of Redemption Gulch as dawn bled reluctantly into the sky. It whipped eddies of red dust around the warped timbers of the buildings and coaxed mournful creaks from the hinges of crudely painted signs. Saloon, Asseyez, General Mercantile. The air hung heavy, still thick with the night's chill, promising a day as unforgiving as the land itself. Light had barely touched the broken-down shack at the edge of town, where the Hayes family clung to a precarious existence when the door splintered inward. Two hulking figures filled the frame, their faces set in expressions of brutish intent. Lars, the larger of the two, a man whose cruelty was a well-known currency in the Gulch, grinned, showing yellowed teeth. Pike, younger, leaner, with eyes as cold and flat as river stones, stood just behind, a silent echo of his partner's menace. They were Judge Silas Blackwood's hounds, and they'd come for Clara, Josiah Hayes, a man hollowed out by cheap whiskey and crushing debt, stumbled back from the doorway, his face a mask of terror and gut-wrenching shame. He could only watch, trembling, as Lars grabbed his daughter, Clara, by the arm. Her resistance wasn't in screams or pleas. She'd learned long ago those were wasted breath. Instead, it was in the rigid line of her spine, the way her chin lifted, and the undiluted contempt that burned in her eyes as she stared down her captors. A coarse rope bit into her slender wrists, cinched tight by Pike, the fibers already chafing her skin raw. Lars jerked the rope viciously. "Move it, bitch," he snarled, his breath foul with the lingering scent of stale liquor. "Don't make the judge angrier than he already is with your paws sniveling." Clara's voice, when she spoke, was raspy from the cold morning air, yet it held a core of steel that belied her youth and slight frame. She didn't flinch from Lars's glare. "His anger is nothing compared to my contempt," she shot back, each word a shard of ice. "Tell Blackwood that. I'll never be his." As they dragged her out into the gray, unforgiving light, a torrent of memories flooded her mind, each one a fresh stab of pain. Her mother's face, gaunt and pale from the sickness that consumed her, a sickness for which there was never enough money for medicine, money siphoned away by Josiah's endless, desperate borrowing from Blackwood, the hollow ring of her father's promises, always broken, always followed by another bout of drinking, another descent into despair, and then the ultimate betrayal, the image of Josiah, his hand shaking, signing the marriage contract that Blackwood had slid across the table, the judge's eyes glinting with predatory satisfaction, the ink sealing Clara's fate as surely as if it were her own blood, the bitter taste of helplessness, the searing agony of being sold like chattel, now coalesced into a white-hot, unyielding rage. They hauled her through the awakening street, Faces began to appear in dusty windows and doorways. Some townsfolk, their eyes filled with a fleeting pity, quickly looked away, cowed by the sight of Blackwood's men. Others watched with a detached indifference, already inured to the casual cruelties of life in Redemption Gulch. A few, clustered near the saloon, whispered and snickered with a perverse, vicarious thrill. Widow Hemlock, the town's laundress, a woman whose own life had been etched with hardship, met Clara's gaze for a brief, sorrowful moment before hastily slamming her door shut, the sound echoing the closing of a coffin lid. In the center of the town square, a barren patch of dirt dominated by a weathered gallows and a dry, cracked water trough. Lars and Pike shoved Clara roughly to her knees. Pike produced a heavy iron chain, its links clinking ominously. He secured one end to her already bound wrists and the other to the thick wooden spokes of a dilapidated freight wagon. Abandoned years ago and left to rot, she was tethered like an animal, an offering displayed for the entire town to witness Judge Blackwood's impending claim. Sheriff Miller, a man whose weary eyes reflected the futility of his position, leaned against a porch post outside his office, meticulously whittling a toothpick. He made a show of not looking, of being utterly absorbed in his task, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed him. Elias Thorne, the town blacksmith, a man whose quiet integrity was a rare commodity in the Gulch, strode towards him, his face a thundercloud of controlled fury. Miller? Elias's voice was a low rumble, laced with indignation. You can't just stand there and let this happen. That girl is barely a woman. This is a crime. Even if it's cloaked in the guise of Blackwood's law. Sheriff Miller finally turned, his gaze skittering away from Elias's directness. His voice was laced with a bitter resignation and something that sounded suspiciously like fear. Crime, Elias. In Redemption Gulch, Judge Blackwood is the law. I'm just the poor bastard paid to sweep up the dung and keep the whole rotten structure from collapsing before its time. What in God's name do you expect me to do? Challenge him. Get myself and my family run out of town, or worse. He gestured vaguely towards Clara. Her father signed the papers. Elias, black and white. Elias Thorne's eyes, filled with a profound sorrow, rested on Clara for a moment before returning to Miller. His disappointment a palpable force, an agreement signed under duress, fueled by liquor and fear, has no damn value. Miller, and you know it, there'll come a reckoning. Mark my words, for all of us. This town will pay dearly for the silence, for the cowardice we've shown here today. With a heavy sigh and a shake of his head, the blacksmith turned on his heel and walked away, the set of his broad back a silent accusation. Clara heard snippets of their exchange. Law, she thought, a bitter, mirthless smile twisting her lips. Blackwood's law, the law of the predator, of the strong preying on the weak. It had never offered her or her family anything but grief and ruin. A lone rider entered Redemption Gulch from the east, moving with an unhurried, almost spectral quiet. His horse, an ash-gray gelding with intelligent eyes, picked its way carefully through the ruts of the street. The man himself was lean, weather-beaten, his face a landscape of harsh lines and shadowed hollows, his expression unreadable. He dismounted in front of Mrs. Martha's General Store, tying the gray, whose name was Dusty, to the hitching rail with an economy of motion that spoke of long habit. Inside the store, the air smelled of coffee beans, cured tobacco, and oiled leather. Ethan Cole, for that was the name he carried, though it felt like a borrowed coat at times, moved with a quiet purpose. He gathered his supplies, a sack of Arbuckle's coffee beans, a smaller one of rolled oats, a slab of dried beef, 2 boxes of 44-40 cartridges for his Winchester, another of 45 Colt for his Peacemaker, and, almost as an afterthought, a small roll of medical gauze. His movements were precise, devoid of any wasted effort. Mrs. Martha, a woman whose age had etched wisdom and a certain wary kindness into her face, watched him from behind the counter. "Mornin', stranger," she offered, her voice a low, cautious rumble. "New to Redemption Gulch, are ya? Might want to tread light today. Specially, here tell Judge Blackwoods. Welcomin' his bride." She leaned forward, lowering her voice conspiratorially, her eyes darting towards the window that overlooked the square. "He's a wolf in sheep's clothing. That one, or rather, a wolf in a judge's robes. Not a man to be crossed, if you value your hide." Ethan Cole's gaze, cool and assessing, swept the dusty shelves before meeting hers. His voice was flat, devoid of inflection. "Just need a few provisions. I'll be on my way directly. No intention of staying or causing any trouble." As he paid, his eyes drifted towards the window. He saw Clara then, chained to the wagon wheel, her head held high despite the indignity, the raw defiance in her posture. He didn't stare, but his attention, sharp and focused, lingered on her for a long moment. There was something in the fierce, unyielding light in her eyes, a desperate courage mixed with a burning hatred, that struck a chord deep within him, a painful, half-forgotten echo. This girl, a fleeting thought, sharp as a spur, pricked his consciousness, accompanied by a ghost image of another woman, another pair of eyes burning with that same untamable fire. She has Sarah's fire, a fire I once stood by and watched men like Blackwood try to extinguish. No, not this time. Not again. The thought was a cold stone in his gut, supplies stowed in his saddlebags. Ethan led Dusty towards the western edge of town. He walked past the square, his gaze fixed ahead, seemingly oblivious to the young woman chained there, or to the curious, fearful glances of the few townsfolk who had braved the morning chill. But as he passed an old, splintered bench a few feet from where Clara was tethered, he paused. For a fraction of a second, he hesitated. Then, with a swift, almost imperceptible movement, he reached into his saddlebag, withdrew a battered tin cup, and placed it on the bench. Steam curled from its rim, carrying the faint, rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee. He didn't speak, didn't glance at Clara. He simply set down the cup and then, with a decisive tug on Dusty's reins, continued his unhurried departure, disappearing down the dusty track leading west. Even in the darkest night, he might have murmured, so low only the wind could hear. Or perhaps it was only a thought, a fleeting expression of a compassion he rarely allowed himself. A single spark can keep hope from dying. Clara watched his retreating figure, her brow furrowed in surprise and suspicion. Her gaze then fell upon the tin cup. A complex wave of emotions washed over her. Disbelief, a flicker of wary gratitude, and then a tiny, almost imperceptible seed of hope, fragile and unbelievable. She didn't move, didn't reach for the coffee. Her eyes remained fixed on it, her senses on high alert. Lars, who had been lounging against the wagon, saw the stranger's act. He let out a coarse laugh. "Well, now, looks like the little slut's got herself an admirer. Don't go gettin' no ideas, girl. Ain't no one gonna save you from the judge, not once he sets his mind on something." He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust near Clara's feet. A few other onlookers murmured amongst themselves. Their curiosity about the silent stranger and his peculiar gesture piqued. The sun climbed, a merciless, brassy disk in the pale sky. The initial chill of dawn had given way to a harsh, dry heat. Dust devils danced across the square. Clara's throat was parched, her stomach a hollow ache. The ropes and chains had rubbed her wrists and ankles raw, each movement sending fresh waves of pain through her. Exhaustion was a leaden weight, pressing down on her, but her spirit, though battered, remained unbroken. A new sound intruded, the rhythmic beat of multiple hooves, the creak of carriage wheels, and the low murmur of voices. A procession was approaching. At its head rode Malachi Thorne, a man whose tailored suit and polished boots seemed out of place in the gritty squalor of Redemption Gulch. He was Silas Blackwood's cousin. Some said, his right-hand man, his major domo, whispered others. Whatever his precise relation, his cunning and unwavering loyalty to the judge were legendary. He rode a sleek black stallion, its coat gleaming like polished obsidian, and behind him trailed 5 or 6 grim-faced men, heavily armed, their eyes cold and watchful. Malachi reined in his horse directly in front of Clara, looking down at her from his superior height. A smile, thin and devoid of warmth, touched his lips, but his eyes were like chips of glacial ice. "Miss Hayes." Malachi's voice was smooth, cultured, yet carried an undercurrent of unmistakable menace. "Judge Silas Blackwood has just arrived at the outskirts of town. He sends his warmest regards." The pause was deliberate, laden with unspoken meaning. He is most eager to meet his beautiful and, shall we say, spirited bride. The wedding ceremony, such as it will be, is scheduled for high noon. I trust you will compose yourself accordingly. Do not keep the judge waiting, Miss Hayes, and pray, cause no further unpleasantness. Clara met his gaze without flinching, her own eyes burning with defiance. The tin cup of coffee, still untouched on the nearby bench, seemed to pulse with a silent rebellion. Her voice, though weakened by thirst and exhaustion, was clear and sharp with contempt as she looked past Malachi, towards the road where Blackwood's entourage would soon appear. "You can go back and tell your judge that hell will freeze solid before I call him husband. You can tell him that before I behave for him, or for any of your ilk. He'll have to kill me first. He'll get my corpse. Malachi, and nothing more." Malachi Thorne's thin smile twisted into a contemptuous sneer. He didn't lash out. He merely nodded, a gesture of cold dismissal. "You'll be begging for the judge's mercy before this day is out. You little whelp," he said softly, almost conversationally. He gestured curtly to Lars and Pike. "Watch her, closely." From the east, the sounds of the approaching party grew louder, more distinct the clatter of hooves, the rumble of a heavy carriage, the coarse laughter of men. The shadow of Silas Blackwood, vast and menacing, was falling squarely over Redemption Gulch, and directly upon Clara Hayes. The noose was tightening. Malachi Thorne's contemptuous sneer lingered in the acrid air, a promise of torments to come. The distant, growing cacophony of Blackwood's approaching entourage was a death knell. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, not with fear. She'd pushed past fear into a realm of cold, unyielding fury, but with the desperate, trapped energy of a cornered animal. The main body of Judge Silas Blackwood's party began to spill into the square. It wasn't the judge himself who appeared. He clearly preferred to let his underlings handle the dirtier, more public displays of his power, perhaps biding his time in the relative comfort of the saloon or Sheriff Miller's office. Instead, Malachi Thorne, now flanked by an even larger contingent of hard-faced men, took center stage. In his hands, he carried a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. With a flourish, he unfurled it, revealing a white lace wedding dress, its pristine elegance a grotesque mockery in this dusty, blood-soaked arena. Trailing behind him like a frightened ghost was Father Michael, the local pastor, his face pale and drawn, his fingers nervously clutching a worn wooden crucifix. "Time to prepare the bride," Malachi announced, his voice carrying easily across the suddenly silent square. He gestured to Lars and Pike. "Make her presentable for the judge." The 2 thugs advanced on Clara, their intentions clear. They meant to strip her of her worn, homespun dress, to humiliate her further before forcing her into the funereal finery of Blackwood's choosing. Lars reached for her, his thick fingers grappling at her shoulder. "Keep your filthy hands off me!" Clara spat, twisting away, her voice raw with defiance. She kicked out, connecting with Lars's shin, a small, desperate act of rebellion. That dress, this whole damn charade, it's not fit for anything but a pigsty. Lars grunted in pain and surprise, his face contorting with rage. Before he could retaliate, Malachi glided forward. With a speed that belied his foppish appearance, he seized Clara by the hair, yanking her head back so sharply that stars exploded behind her eyes. His face was inches from hers, his voice a venomous hiss. "You will hold your tongue, you stubborn little bitch! You are Judge Blackwood's property now, and property does not speak. It does not resist. It learns to obey. It learns to be grateful for any crumbs of mercy its master deigns to offer. You will wear this dress, and you will stand before him, and you will do so with a smile. Or by God, I will carve one onto your face myself." He punctuated his threat by signaling Lars, who backhanded Clara across the mouth. The taste of blood, sharp and metallic, filled her mouth. Through a haze of pain, Clara saw Father Michael. He stood a short distance away, his lips moving in a silent, trembling prayer, his eyes fixed on the ground, on his crucifix, anywhere but on her. She stared at him, a silent scream of accusation, of desperate appeal mixed with a bottomless, searing contempt. The pastor, feeling the weight of her gaze, finally looked up, his own eyes filled with a wretched, apologetic shame. "Child," he began, his voice weak, barely audible. Sometimes the sacrifice of one is necessary for the peace of many. Think of this as the cross you must bear, for your father's safety, for the tenuous tranquility of this poor, benighted town. Judge Blackwood. He is not a man one can afford to provoke. Surely, you understand that—" His words trailed off, a pathetic excuse for complicity. Clara turned her head away, disgust coiling in her stomach. Peace, tranquility, words that meant nothing when bought at the price of a soul. Unseen, unheard. Ethan Cole watched. He hadn't ridden far. The western road had been a feint. He lay prone on the flat, sun-baked roof of a two-story adobe building, abandoned and crumbling, directly opposite the square. The position offered a commanding view, a sniper's perch. His Winchester, cleaned and oiled with a practiced hand, rested steady on a low parapet, its barrel cool against his cheek. The tin cup of coffee sat beside him. Cold now, forgotten, the scene below ignited a firestorm in his memory, images flaring with a painful, visceral clarity. His wife, Sarah, his Sarah, not the defiant girl in the square, but the woman whose laughter had once been his son, her face pale with terror, her eyes wide with dawning horror. Their daughter, Emily, a child of sunshine and wildflowers, clinging to Sarah's skirts, her small body racked with sobs. They had been cornered, just like this girl, by a man whose power and cruelty mirrored Blackwood's, a man whose name Ethan still couldn't speak without a taste of ash in his mouth. He remembered the crushing weight of his own helplessness, the way fear had paralyzed him, the hesitation that had cost him everything. He had stood by, a spectator to their destruction, and the shame of it, the guilt, had been his constant companion ever since, a shadow that clung to him. Colder than any winter night, he watched Malachi's brutal manhandling of Clara, heard the sickening crack of Lars's hand against her face. His grip on the Winchester tightened, his knuckles turning white. Enough. The word was a silent roar in his soul. I stood by once. I let fear chain me while they destroyed everything I loved. Never again. Sarah. Emily. His throat constricted. I won't let it happen again. Not while I draw breath. The decision, once made, settled in him like a stone, cold and absolute. There would be no more hesitation, no more watching from the shadows. He drew a slow, steady breath, letting it out just as slowly. His eye sighted down the long barrel of the Winchester. He wasn't aiming at Malachi, or Lars, or any of the other curs. His target was the heavy iron chain that still tethered Clara's bound wrists to the wagon wheel, the other end having been released when they pulled her up. He calculated the angle, the slight tremor of the wind that whispered across the rooftops. He had to sever the chain without harming the girl. One shot. That's all he'd likely get. The moment stretched, taut as a hangman's rope. Down in the square, Malachi, impatient, barked an order. Hold her still. Damn you. Get that dress on her. Lars and Pike grabbed Clara's arms. Their grips like iron vises. She fought them with the ferocity of a wildcat, twisting, kicking, her teeth sinking into Pike's forearm, drawing a yelp of pain and a string of curses. It was in that chaotic instant, as Clara's struggles reached a desperate crescendo, that Ethan squeezed the trigger. The crack of the Winchester shattered the tense, ugly silence of the square. It was a sound cleaner, sharper, more definitive than any word spoken that morning. A small puff of dust and splinters erupted from the thick wooden spoke of the wagon wheel where the chain was looped. Sparks flew as the heavy iron link, struck dead center by Ethan's 4440 slug, shattered and sprang apart. Clara, suddenly free, stumbled forward, her momentum carrying her almost to her knees before she caught herself. Her hand splayed on the dusty ground. For a stunned second, absolute silence reigned. Then, Ethan's voice, hard and cold as a January wind, cut through the air, amplified by the shocked stillness. He remained unseen, his position a mystery. Listen up, Blackwood's hounds. The words cracked like a whip. Those chains aren't for her. And this rifle says you won't lay another hand on her. Not a single hair. Anyone takes another step towards that girl, anyone so much as thinks of harming her, the next bullet won't go astray. I swear it on my life. The effect was instantaneous. Malachi Thorne, who had been about to strike Clara again, froze, his face a mask of disbelief that quickly contorted into a mask of incandescent rage. His carefully crafted composure shattered. You nameless bastard, he shrieked, his voice cracking. Who in the goddamned hell are you to interfere in the affairs of Judge Silas Blackwood? You'll swing for this. Men, find him, seize him, kill that interfering son of a bitch. Kill him now. Blackwood's henchmen, caught completely off guard, reacted with a mixture of fear and confusion. Some instinctively recoiled, their hands flying to their holstered pistols. Others spun around, trying to locate the source of the shot, their eyes darting nervously towards the rooftops and shadowed alleyways. A few drew their weapons but hesitated to fire blindly, unsure of Ethan's position, fearful of hitting one of their own in the ensuing crossfire. Sheriff Miller, who had been trying to make himself invisible against the wall of his office, finally reacted, though not in any way that suggested control. Everybody get down. Clear the square, he yelled, his voice trembling, addressing the few remaining townspeople who had been drawn by the commotion. This is Judge's business. Stay out of it. If you value your skins. He fumbled for his own pistol, but it remained holstered, his hands shaking too much. He looked utterly overwhelmed, a man drowning in a flood. He had no power to stop. Clara, breathless, her heart pounding like a war drum, pushed herself to her feet. Disbelief, then a wild, surging hope, flooded through her. She stared in the direction from which the shot had come, her eyes scanning the rooftops, searching desperately for the silhouette of her unseen protector, the man whose coffee still sat untouched, a small, potent symbol of defiance. Ethan didn't give them time to regroup. He knew he couldn't stay exposed. A second shot rang out, then a third, not aimed at any man, but at targets chosen for maximum psychological impact. One bullet shattered the large glass jar of pickled eggs in the saloon window, sending shards and stinking brine flying. Another slammed into the wooden water barrel beside Malachi, splitting the staves and sending a geyser of water into the air, drenching the sputtering, furious man. The message was clear. I can hit whatever I choose. Then, as quickly as he had announced his presence, Ethan Cole vanished. He didn't melt into the shadows. He moved with a calculated, fluid grace, using the rooftops and the narrow, garbage-strewn alleyways as his personal domain. He knew this town, or towns like it, intimately. He was a ghost, a whisper, gone before they could fix his position. Down in the square, the initial shock and fear among Blackwood's men quickly curdled into a humiliated rage. Malachi Thorne, dripping wet and shaking with fury, his face purple, turned his venomous attention back to Clara. If he couldn't immediately lay hands on the mysterious gunman, he would vent his spleen on the cause of his public humiliation. "Find that bastard!" he screamed, his voice hoarse. "Tear this whole damn town apart if you have to. I want his head on a pike. And as for this little bitch," he jabbed a trembling finger at Clara. "She will pay 100-fold for the insult she and her mystery lover have dealt the judge. 100-fold. Tie her up tight. Judge Blackwood will want to educate her personally before he officially takes possession of his property. Take her to the old freight warehouse behind the saloon." Now, Lars and Pike, their earlier arrogance replaced by a sullen, brutal anger, lunged for Clara. She was unchained. Yes, and for a glorious moment, she had tasted a sliver of hope. But now, she was alone again, facing a mob more dangerous, more enraged than before. She had no weapon, but she would not go down without a fight. As Lars reached for her, she snatched up a heavy, splintered piece of wood from the wagon wheel, a fragment broken off when Ethan's bullet had shattered the chain link. She swung it wildly, desperately, connecting with Pike's outstretched arm with a dull thud. The square, moments before alive with sound and fury, fell into an eerie, almost complete silence, broken only by the grunts of the men and Clara's defiant gasps as she fought. The windows of Redemption Gulch were empty now. Every door was shut tight. No one dared to watch. Clara stood alone, a small, fierce figure of resistance against overwhelming odds. Her makeshift club a pathetic defense against their numbers and their malice. Malachi's curses and the guttural shouts of his men filled the air. The struggle was brutal, uneven, and terrifyingly short. Where had Ethan Cole gone? Had his intervention been a fleeting act, a single shot fired for a ghost of his past? Or was there more to his silent promise? And Clara, now disarmed and overpowered, what fresh horrors awaited her in the dim confines of the warehouse, at the hands of a humiliated Malachi Thorne, and under the impending, wrathful judgment of Silas Blackwood himself? The dust of Redemption Gulch swirled, offering no answers, only the grim certainty of more suffering to come. Malachi Thorne's enraged bellows, the panicked shouts of his men, the sudden, sharp crack of Ethan's rifle, faded into a tense, watchful silence on the outskirts of Redemption Gulch. Ethan Cole hadn't ridden far. He was a coiled viper in the shadows, now occupying the dusty, hay-strewn loft of a long-abandoned blacksmith's shop. Its grimy window, little more than a missing plank, offered a strategic, if narrow, view of the alleyway leading to the rear of the dusty spur, saloon, and, more importantly, the hulking, dilapidated freight warehouse adjacent to it. He'd seen them drag Clara, a small, defiant figure swallowed by the brawn of Lars, Pike, and a couple of other Blackwood curs, into its gloomy depths. Malachi Thorne's furious, spittle-flecked face had been the last thing visible before the heavy warehouse doors slammed shut. Ethan's jaw was a hard line. The initial intervention, shooting the chain, had been an impulse born of a searing, resurrected grief, a desperate, almost symbolic act. He'd thought, perhaps naively, that it might be enough, a warning. He'd been wrong, dead wrong. The number of armed men now milling about the warehouse, their nervousness making them twice as jumpy and dangerous, told him that they were stirred-up hornets, and a frontal assault now would be suicide, achieving nothing but his own quick death and sealing Clara's fate. He needed another plan, something sharper, something that cut deeper than a single bullet. The ghosts of his past were relentless, their whispers a constant torment. Sarah, Emily, their faces swam before him, etched with the same terror he'd seen flicker in Clara's eyes. But the pain, once a paralyzing anchor, was now a whetstone, honing his resolve to a razor's edge. He'd intervened. He'd cast his lot. There was no walking away now, not without that old, familiar shadow engulfing him completely. He cursed his own earlier short-sightedness. Fool. He berated himself. The word, a bitter taste, thought breaking her chains was enough to free her. These bastards! They don't let go that easy. This time. Cole, you get her out. All the way out. Out of this whole damn cursed town. You owe her that. And you owe it to Sarah, too. No more turning back. His mind, honed by years of survival in unforgiving landscapes and even more unforgiving company, began to work with cold precision. He observed the guards, their sloppy patrol patterns, the way some congregated to share a muttered conversation or a furtive swig from a hidden flask, the predictable rhythm of their complacency beginning to reassert itself despite their earlier fright. He noted the layout of the buildings, the narrowness of the alleys, the potential blind spots. Darkness would be his ally, but he needed more than just the night. He needed a diversion, something big enough to draw the wolves away from the sheep pen, even if only for a precious few minutes. Inside the warehouse, the air was thick with the stench of mildew, rotting grain, and the scuttling fear of rats in the walls. It was a cavern of shadows, broken only by a few slivers of dusty light penetrating gaps in the boarded-up windows. Lars and Pike, under Malachi's explicit, venomous instructions, had bound Clara to a massive central support pillar. The ropes were new, biting cruelly into the raw flesh of her wrists and ankles. Tighter this time, a clear message. For a while, they'd gagged her too, but Malachi, in a fit of perverse magnanimity, had ordered it removed, perhaps wanting to hear her pleas later. Malachi Thorne himself paid her several visits throughout the long, agonizing afternoon and into the deepening twilight. He didn't lay a hand on her physically. Judge Blackwood, he implied with a leering insinuation, preferred his property undamaged, at least initially. Instead, Malachi wielded words like a surgeon's scalpel, each sentence designed to flay her spirit, to dissect her hope. He spoke of the judge's monumental displeasure, of the inventive and excruciating lessons Blackwood reserved for those who defied him, of the certain grisly fate awaiting the nameless hero who had dared to interfere. Comfortable, are we, my little firebrand? He'd purr, his voice a silken caress that sent shivers of revulsion down her spine. He'd pace before her, a predatory cat savoring its trapped mouse. Judge Blackwood is anticipating your formal acquaintance in the morning. He has so many questions for you, and such creative ideas for your re-education. And as for your mysterious champion out there, he'd pause, letting the threat hang heavy. Well, let's just say the judge has a very long memory and even longer reach. You should have taken the coffee. My dear, it might have been your last small comfort. He'd laugh then, a dry, rasping sound that held no humor. Lars and Pike, when Malachi wasn't present, took their own crude pleasure in her torment. They denied her water, despite the choking dust and the oppressive heat that lingered in the warehouse. They made lewd jests, their eyes lingering on her in ways that made her skin crawl. But Clara, though fear was a cold knot in her belly and every inch of her body ached, refused to break. She bit down on her lip until she tasted blood again, anchoring herself to the pain, letting it fuel the embers of her defiance. She thought of Ethan Cole. Had he truly gone? Or was that single, inexplicable act of kindness, the coffee, the shot, a genuine spark in the overwhelming darkness? She clung to that fragile, almost foolish hope, scanning her prison for any sign, any weakness, any chance, however remote, as the town clock in the distant, unseen square laboriously chimed 3, marking the deepest, darkest hour of the night. Ethan moved. His plan was audacious, born of desperation and a cold, calculated rage. He'd spent hours observing, waiting. Now, at the far end of Redemption Gulch, near the livery stables where Judge Blackwood's own prize horses were quartered, a carefully set fire in a shed piled high with old hay and discarded lumber suddenly roared to life. The dry timber caught with an explosive whoosh, flames leaping into the night sky, painting the underside of the low clouds a lurid, flickering orange. The diversion was instantaneous and effective. Shouts erupted across town. The clang of the fire bell, frantic and insistent, shattered the night's quiet. Men, startled from their sleep or their card games, poured out of the saloon and the rooming houses, their attention drawn inexorably towards the blaze. Even the guards around the warehouse, their earlier vigilance eroded by hours of boredom and perhaps a shared bottle, were visibly distracted, their heads turned towards the growing inferno. This was Ethan's chance. He slipped from the blacksmith's loft like a wraith, using the deeper shadows of the alley, his movements swift and silent. The chaos was his shield. He had to bypass the few remaining guards, their senses now dulled by the greater excitement. He saw 2 of them, their backs to him, gawking at the distant fire. A quick, silent approach, the butt of his Colt rising and falling twice with brutal efficiency. The men crumpled without a sound. He dragged them deeper into the shadows, bound and gagged them with strips of cloth torn from a discarded grain sack. The warehouse door was barred from the outside. He'd anticipated this. A few moments of focused effort with his heavy Bowie knife, leveraging the bar upwards, and it lifted free with a low groan of tortured wood. He slipped inside. The darkness was almost absolute, the air heavy and still. He paused, letting his eyes adjust, his ears straining. He could hear Clara's breathing, shallow and ragged, somewhere in the center of the vast space. He found her, a pale shape against the darker bulk of the pillar. She was slumped against her bonds, seemingly asleep or unconscious. But as he knelt beside her, her eyes fluttered open, and in the faint light filtering from the distant fire through a crack in the wall, he saw a flicker of recognition, then a surge of utter disbelief. "Clara," he whispered, his voice urgent, his knife already slicing through the thick ropes. "Let's go. Not much time. This time we get clear of this hellhole for good." Her voice was a barely audible croak, trembling with a mixture of exhaustion and overwhelming emotion. "Ethan, I thought you'd gone. Think later." He cut her off gently, helping her to her feet. Her legs were stiff, unsteady. Survive now. Go. They moved through the warehouse, Ethan supporting her, his senses on high alert, the sounds of the town fighting the fire. Shouts, the crackle of flames, the thud of running feet, provided a chaotic symphony to cover their escape. Ethan had planned well. Dusty was tethered in a thicket of mesquite, just beyond the last shacks on the western edge of town, along with a wiry Mustang packhorse he'd requisitioned earlier, its saddlebags already loaded with a meager stash of water, jerky, and ammunition. He'd chosen a direction opposite to the fire, hoping to slip away unnoticed. But their luck, it seemed, was a fickle mistress. As they reached the edge of town, a group of riders, silhouetted against the orange glow of the distant blaze, suddenly appeared, cutting off their path. Malachi Thorne, his face contorted with fury, was at their head. He must have sensed the ruse, or perhaps one of the downed guards had been discovered. "There they are," Malachi shrieked, pointing. "Don't let them escape. Shoot the bastard. I want the girl alive." A short, desperate chase ensued. They plunged into the darkness beyond the town, Ethan firing back over his shoulder with his peacemaker, trying to slow their pursuers, while Clara clung to Dusty's mane, her initial shock giving way to a grim determination. The packhorse, startled by the gunfire, bolted alongside them. Bullets whined past their ears. Ethan felt a searing pain as one grazed his cheek. Drawing blood, he pushed Dusty harder into the broken, uneven terrain of the open desert, the lights of Redemption Gulch receding behind them like the fires of hell. By some miracle of reckless riding, Ethan's desperate, accurate return fire, and the pursuer's own caution in the treacherous darkness, they managed to pull ahead, the sounds of pursuit gradually fading. They rode on, into the vast, star-dusted emptiness of the Arizona night, not daring to look back. For the rest of that night, and all through the next blistering day, they pushed relentlessly onward, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and Redemption Gulch. Silence, heavy and profound, enveloped them, born of exhaustion, shock, and the unspoken terrors they had faced. Clara, her body aching, her spirit battered but not broken, rode in a daze, occasionally stealing glances at the grim, set profile of the man who had twice risked everything for her. Ethan, his focus absolute, scanned the horizon, chose their path, ever watchful, ever alert. The Arizona wilderness was a harsh, unforgiving crucible. The sun beat down with a merciless intensity, baking the parched earth, while the nights brought a bone-chilling cold. Water was a precious, life-giving mirage. Ethan, drawing on a deep well of hard-earned survival knowledge, led them. He showed Clara how to find moisture in the hollow of a barrel cactus, how to read the subtle signs of a hidden seep spring. He shared his meager rations, always ensuring she had the larger portion. Clara, in turn, though weak and still reeling, refused to be a mere passenger. She learned quickly, her innate resilience surfacing. She would take a watch while he snatched a few hours of restless sleep, her eyes scanning the darkness, her hand never far from the small skinning knife Ethan had given her. It was on their third night out, huddled in the shallow lee of a wind-scoured sandstone outcrop, a tiny fire flickering bravely against the immense, indifferent darkness, that the dam of silence finally broke. Clara stared into the flames, her voice low, still tinged with disbelief. "Why, Ethan, why did you come back? Again, you owed me nothing. You could have been miles away, safe." Ethan looked out at the star-dusted infinity of the desert night, the silence stretching between them before he spoke, his voice heavy with a weariness that went deeper than mere physical exhaustion. "I told you once, Clara, there are some things a man sees, some wrongs so profound, that if he turns his back, the shadow of it follows him, eats at him. Last time, I chose to walk away. And that shadow, it's been my closest companion for too many years. A flicker of understanding, of shared pain, passed between them. Last time, Clara asked softly, "What happened?" Ethan's voice dropped, the words raw, scraped from a place of deep, unhealed sorrow. He didn't offer details. Not yet. The wound was too deep, too sacred. I failed to protect those I loved most from men like Blackwood, men who use their power to crush, to destroy. He paused, his gaze distant. I thought I wasn't strong enough then, or brave enough. I won't make that mistake again. Never. Clara, sensing the abyss of his grief, didn't press further. Instead, a little of her own story trickled out. The shame of her father's weakness, the suffocating dread of Blackwood's claim, her desperate vow to die rather than submit. Words were few, but in the shared silence, in the flickering firelight, a bond, forged in terror and tempered by a grudging respect, began to take root. They were two solitary, wounded souls, adrift in a hostile world, finding a fragile, unspoken solace in each other's presence. Rest now. Clara, Ethan said finally, his voice rough but gentle. Tomorrow will be another hard ride. Blackwood won't give up this easily. He met her gaze, a silent promise passing between them. But we'll face him. Together, dawn broke, painting the stark desert landscape in hues of apricot and rose. A fragile peace settled over them, shattered almost immediately. As they prepared to move out, Ethan, his senses preternaturally sharp, stiffened. He pointed to the distant southern horizon, a faint, almost imperceptible plume of dust, too regular, too persistent to be caused by the wind. Then, carried on the morning breeze, the faintest, far-off baying of hounds. Damn him, Ethan muttered, his voice grim. They're on our trail. Clara, closer than I figured. And those won't be saloon sweepings. He's sent his best trackers. They looked at each other. The fear was still there, a cold knot in their bellies. But it was overlaid now with a shared, steely resolve. The flight was far from over. The true test had just begun. Without a word, they mounted, urging their tired horses into a desperate gallop towards the hazy, forbidding line of mountains that shimmered on the western horizon, the unseen, relentless shadow of their pursuers already lengthening behind them. What did you think of today's story? If it made your day, drop a good in the comments. If it didn't hit the mark, just type 1. Got your own thoughts? I'd love to hear them below. And hey, don't forget to hit subscribe. It's free, and it really helps the channel grow. Thank you so much for being here. The Arizona sun beat down with a relentless, white-hot fury, baking the cracked earth and shimmering off the distant, saw-toothed peaks. Days blurred into a desperate, sun-scorched, and moon-haunted rhythm of flight. Ethan Cole, his face a mask of grim determination, pushed them onward, his knowledge of the unforgiving land their only shield. Clara, her initial fragility burned away by the crucible of their ordeal, matched his pace, her resilience a quiet miracle. They ate when they could find sparse game or edible roots, drank sparingly from dwindling canteens refilled at bitter, alkali seeps, and slept in fits and starts, always with one eye open, one ear straining for the telltale sounds of pursuit. But one eye. Jack Rourke was a bloodhound of singular, terrifying skill. He and his hand-picked cadre of manhunters, bought and paid for by Judge Silas Blackwood's bottomless coffers, clung to their trail like a persistent, venomous shadow. Rourke was more than just a tracker. He was a predator, his mind as sharp and cruel as the Bowie knife he wore strapped to his thigh. He anticipated Ethan's feints, read the subtle signs of their passage where a lesser man would see only undisturbed wilderness. The gap, Ethan knew with a sickening certainty, was closing. One brutal evening, as they huddled in the scant cover of a rocky arroyo, the wind keening like a banshee, Ethan laid it bare. His voice was flat, devoid of false hope, his eyes meeting Clara's in the dying light. They're too good. Clara! Rourke. He's not like the others. We can't outrun him forever. Sooner or later, they'll pin us down. Our horses are failing, and we're not far behind." He paused, the silence heavy with unspoken dread. "We have a choice. Keep running till we drop from exhaustion and they take us like tethered goats. Or we find a place where we can make a stand, fight it out on our terms, or as close to 'em as we can get. At least then, we'd die looking 'em in the eye." Clara listened, her gaze unwavering. The girl who had been dragged from her father's shack in Redemption Gulch was gone, replaced by a woman whose eyes held the hard, unyielding glitter of tempered steel. The fear was still there, a cold serpent in her belly, but it was dwarfed by a burning hatred for Blackwood and an incandescent will to survive, to be free. "I'm done running, Ethan," she said, her voice low but firm, each word resonating with a newfound strength. "I won't be hounded like an animal any longer. If fighting is what it takes to breathe free, then I'll fight. Show me what needs doing. I'm not afraid of dying. I'm only afraid of living under another's thumb, another's brand. A flicker of something. Respect. Perhaps even a grim sort of pride." Touched Ethan's hard features. He nodded slowly. "There's a place," he said, his voice thoughtful. "An old miner's shack I stumbled on years ago, tucked high on the side of a narrow box canyon. Sheer rock at its back. One hellish trail leading up. Defensible. If we can reach it before Rourke cuts us off, it's our best. Maybe our only shot." The journey to that forgotten canyon was a new descent into hell. They pushed their failing horses, and themselves, to the very brink of collapse. Rourke's pursuit a palpable pressure at their backs. Twice, they'd caught glimpses of his outriders, distant, ominous figures on the skyline, forcing them into desperate detours through even more treacherous terrain. But finally, half dead from exhaustion and thirst, they stumbled into the narrow cleft of the canyon, the dilapidated miner's shack. A welcome, if grim, sight perched precariously on the scree-strewn slope. Time was a luxury they didn't have. With Rourke's men likely hours, perhaps minutes, behind, they worked with a frantic, desperate energy. The shack was little more than a collection of rotting timbers and loose stones, but its position was its strength. They dragged heavy rocks to reinforce the crumbling walls, used fallen logs to barricade the single doorway and the two small window openings, creating crude firing slits. Sweat stung Ethan's eyes. His wounded cheek throbbed, but he worked relentlessly. Clara beside him, her face smudged with dirt and grime, her movements economical and determined. Ethan had his Winchester, the Colt Peacemaker, and a handful of cartridges for each. He pressed the Peacemaker, along with the bulk of the 45 rounds, into Clara's hands. "You know how to use this," he said, his voice rough. "In here, close quarters. Aim for the center. Don't waste shots. Reload when you get a chance, not when you're empty." He quickly outlined their simple, brutal plan. He'd take the main approach, the narrow, switchbacking trail that was their only access point. Clara would cover his flank, watch for any attempt to scale the rock face above or behind them. The wait was an agony. The silence of the canyon pressed in, broken only by the dry rasp of the wind and the frantic, suffocating thunder of their own hearts. They shared the last of their jerky, the last few sips of tepid water from Ethan's canteen. There were no tender farewells, no words of fear, only a grim, shared resolve, a silent acknowledgement of the abyss they faced, and an unspoken, absolute trust that had been forged in the crucible of their shared ordeal. Clara wiped a bead of sweat from her forehead with the back of a trembling hand. She looked at Ethan, her voice remarkably steady. Do you really think we have a chance, Ethan, to walk away from this?" Ethan finished checking the action of his Winchester. the metallic click loud in the stillness. His eyes were chips of flint, utterly focused. "Chances ain't handed out. Clara," he said, his voice flat and hard. "They're bought and paid for, with blood, with sweat, with everything a man's got. Today, we make our own, whatever the cost. They won't take us easy." She nodded. A single, sharp movement. Her hand tightened on the butt of the peacemaker. "I understand. I won't let you down. Ethan, I'll fight for my freedom, for what they did to my father, to my mother." And her voice dropped almost to a whisper, but her eyes blazed. "For you too." A rare, almost imperceptible softening touched Ethan's grim features. "I know you will, Clara," he said, his voice holding a quiet conviction. "I'm counting on it." It wasn't long before the first riders appeared at the mouth of the canyon. Not just Rourke's lean, hard-bitten trackers this time. Judge Silas Blackwood himself, resplendent on a magnificent white stallion, his expensive broadcloth suit a stark, obscene contrast to the dusty, blood-soaked land, led a formidable force, Lars and Pike, their faces bearing the marks of their earlier encounters, were there, along with a score of other hired guns, their expressions predatory and eager. Blackwood, his face a mask of arrogant certainty, clearly intended this to be the final act, a public and brutal assertion of his dominion. From a safe position at the canyon's entrance, well out of rifle range, a rider bearing a white flag advanced a short way up the trail. Then, Blackwood's voice, amplified by a speaking trumpet, boomed across the desolate landscape, each word dripping with contempt and a chilling, absolute power. "Ethan Cole, and the whore, Clara Hayes, your pathetic, verminous resistance is at an end. I, Judge Silas Blackwood, the embodiment of law and order in this territory, offer you one final opportunity to save your worthless skins. Throw down your weapons. Surrender the woman to my justice, Cole, and I may yet find a sliver of mercy for you. You might even live to witness her re-education. Defy me, and I swear by all that's holy and unholy, your deaths will be an agony beyond imagining. Your carcasses left for the coyotes and the carrion birds. One-Eye Jack Rourke, his single eye glittering with a cold, professional amusement, added his own gravelly warning. Cole, you're a decent shot. I'll give you that. Don't throw your life away for this little piece of baggage. The judge is offering a king's ransom for your scalp, but you give up the girl, nice and easy. I might just convince him to let you ride out of here. Mostly intact. Silence answered them from the besieged cabin, a long, pregnant silence that stretched taut, fraying Blackwood's manufactured composure. Ethan's voice was a low murmur beside Clara. Don't listen to him. Clara, words are cheap. He just wants to break us before the fight even starts. Remember what we said. We fight. Then, Clara's voice, surprisingly clear and strong, rang out from one of the cabin's firing slits, cutting through the tense quiet, a clear note of defiance against the judge's bombast. Silas Blackwood, my freedom isn't a trinket for you to buy with your threats or steal with your bullies. You want me, then come and get me, if you've got the guts. But be warned, Judge, the price for this piece of land will be steep indeed. Apoplectic with rage at this public insolence, Blackwood roared his command. Rourke, take them. I want them alive, if possible, but take them. The assault, when it came, was a wave of violence. Rourke's men, skilled and ruthless, charged up the narrow, treacherous trail, using what little cover the rocks afforded, while others attempted to find alternate routes up the steep canyon walls. Ethan and Clara met them with a coordinated fury. The Winchester roared, Ethan's shots finding their mark with deadly precision, dropping the lead attackers, sending others tumbling back down the slope. Clara's peacemaker spat flame, her shots less accurate perhaps, but fired with a desperate courage that helped to break the momentum of the charge, covering Ethan as he reloaded, forcing the attackers to keep their heads down. The battle for the miner's shack became a brutal, close-quarters hell. Twice, attackers managed to reach the cabin itself, scrabbling at the windows, trying to kick in the door. The first time, Ethan met them with a blast from his Winchester that sent one man sprawling backward, his chest a bloody ruin. The second, as Ethan was pinned down by Rourke's own covering fire, a sinewy, knife-wielding cutthroat managed to pry loose a board beside a window. He lunged through the opening, his eyes alight with murderous intent. Clara, her pistol empty, reacted with pure, unthinking instinct. She grabbed a heavy iron skillet, left behind by the miners, and swung it with all her might, connecting with the side of the man's head with a sickening crunch. He dropped like a pole-axed steer, saving Ethan's life. Her transformation was complete. She was a warrior, baptized in gunpowder and blood. The duel between Ethan and One-Eye Jack Rourke was a fight unto itself, a deadly ballet of skill and savagery amidst the larger chaos. Rourke, a phantom in the rocks, his shots uncannily accurate, managed to wound Ethan, a bullet tearing through the fleshy part of his thigh, sending a jolt of agony through him. But Ethan, fueled by a desperate need to protect Clara, fought through the pain. He caught a glimpse of Rourke's single, malevolent eye as the manhunter shifted position. Ethan's answering shot was instantaneous, a snapshot of pure instinct. Rourke staggered, clutched at his chest, a look of stunned disbelief on his face, before collapsing behind a boulder, silenced for good, witnessing his most feared enforcer fall, and his force being decimated by the two trapped hornets in the shack. Silas Blackwood descended into a sputtering, incoherent rage. He drew his own silver-inlaid pistols, firing wildly, his shots going harmlessly wide, screaming at his dwindling men to press the attack, to burn them out, to do something. The casualty count among Blackwood's forces was horrific. The narrow trail was littered with their dead and wounded, their cries of pain and fear a ghastly chorus to the ongoing gunfire. The morale of the remaining attackers shattered. They had come expecting an easy slaughter, not this meat grinder. In a final, insane paroxysm of fury, Blackwood, seeing his victory slipping away, his authority mocked, tried to rally his few remaining, terrified men for one last, desperate charge up the blood-slicked trail. He spurred his white stallion forward, a grotesque figure of impotent rage. It was then, amidst the swirling gun smoke and the screams of the dying, that Blackwood's reign of terror effectively ended. A bullet, whether from Ethan's Winchester, fired through a haze of pain, or from Clara's peacemaker, her aim now steady and true as she defended the man who had defended her, struck the judge. It caught him high in the shoulder, spinning him from his saddle. He landed in a heap, his fine clothes torn and bloodied, his face a mask of astonished agony. The wound wasn't immediately fatal, but it was a crippling, ignominious blow, the visible, undeniable symbol of his utter, humiliating defeat. With Blackwood down and Rourke dead, the last vestiges of fight drained from his remaining men. A few scrambled to their fallen leader's side. The rest, their nerve completely broken, threw down their weapons and fled, a panicked, disorganized rabble, abandoning the canyon and their dying master, slowly, cautiously. Ethan, leaning heavily on his rifle, his leg a throbbing torment, and Clara, her face grimed with powder smoke, but her eyes blazing with a fierce, triumphant light, emerged from the shattered ruins of the cabin. They stood over Silas Blackwood, who lay thrashing in the dust, tended by two of his remaining sycophants, his arrogance replaced by a contorted mask of pain and impotent fury. You curse. Blackwood spat, blood flecking his lips. You haven't won. I'll hunt you to the ends of the earth. I'll see you both hang for this. This isn't over." Clara looked down at him, her gaze cold, unwavering, utterly devoid of fear. "You're wrong, Blackwood," she said, her voice clear and steady above his pained gasps. "It is over. I was never your property. I never will be. Your power was built on fear, on the silence of those you terrorized. Today, that fear and that silence died here, with your men, with your filthy pride. Get out of my sight, and if you ever dare to cross my path again, your end will be far swifter and far less noteworthy." Ethan, after ensuring the remaining henchmen were disarmed, looked down at the fallen tyrant with a weary contempt. "Take your lesson, Blackwood," he said, his voice raspy. "Take your dead and your shame, and let them serve as a warning. Redemption Gulch is free of your shadow. Your kind of law dies hard, but it dies, and if you ever think of harming her again." He didn't need to finish the threat. His eyes, cold and hard as granite, said it all. Blackwood's men, under Ethan's unwavering, menacing gaze, hastily lifted their groaning, bleeding master and began their humiliating retreat from the canyon, leaving behind a scene of carnage, a testament to the price of defiance. Ethan and Clara stood together amidst the wreckage, the setting sun casting long, somber shadows, exhausted, wounded, but unbowed, victorious. They looked at each other, a universe of shared experience, of respect earned in the crucible of combat, passing between them in the silence. The immediate threat was gone, but the taste of gunpowder and the specter of what they had endured lingered, a heavy, indelible mark on the quietening canyon. The retreat of Silas Blackwood's tattered remnants left an echoing void in the narrow canyon. The sudden, almost absolute silence that descended was heavier, more oppressive, than the din of battle that had preceded it. Only the mournful sigh of the wind through the rock spires and the ragged, gasping breaths of Ethan Cole and Clara Hayes disturbed the profound stillness. The acrid tang of gunpowder, the coppery scent of fresh blood, and the gritty taste of dust still coated the air, a grim perfume of their hard-won survival. Outside the bullet-scarred, dilapidated miner's shack, the ground was a testament to the ferocity of their stand. Several of Blackwood's men lay sprawled in the grotesque postures of violent death. One-Eye Jack Rourke, his single eye now staring blankly at the indifferent sky, was among them. It was a hideous tableau, a butcher's bill tallied in human lives, but it was also the undeniable proof of their victory, their miraculous defiance against overwhelming odds. Inside, they moved with the slow, deliberate caution of those who had pushed their bodies and spirits to the very edge of annihilation, and somehow found their way back. The adrenaline had ebbed, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness and the throbbing protest of their wounds. Together, with a quiet, unspoken understanding, they began to tend to each other. Ethan's left shoulder, where one of Rourke's bullets had torn through flesh and muscle, was a bloody mess. He was pale, his movements stiff and pained. Clara, her own face bruised, a cut still weeping blood above her eyebrow, her clothes torn and filthy, displayed a surprising, almost preternatural calm. She tore strips from her already tattered petticoat, using the last of their precious water to gently cleanse the raw, angry wound on Ethan's shoulder. Her touch was surprisingly deft, her focus absolute. Ethan, in turn, despite the agony that shot through him with every movement, insisted on examining the cut on her head, dabbing at it awkwardly with another piece of cloth. These ministrations were devoid of any self-consciousness, any lingering awkwardness. The barriers that had once stood between them, a stranger's caution, a young woman's fear, had been consumed in the crucible of shared combat. What remained was a raw, unvarnished intimacy, a profound concern born not of affection, but of a shared journey through the valley of the shadow of death. They were two souls bound by the indelible ink of spilled blood and whispered fears. This looks bad, Ethan," Clara murmured, her voice trembling slightly as she tried to bind the makeshift bandage tightly around his shoulder. "You've lost a sight of blood. You need to lie still, rest properly, else it'll fester for sure." Ethan managed a faint, grim smile, his eyes, usually so guarded, now holding a rare, unguarded gentleness as he looked at her. His voice was a hoarse rasp. "I'll be all right. Clara, just a scratch." He winced as she tightened the bandage. You were brave out there. More than brave. Strong. I reckon I owe you my life. More than once over." Clara shook her head, a faint flush rising beneath the grime on her cheeks. "We don't owe each other a thing, Ethan," she said softly, her gaze meeting his. "We survived. Together. That's all that counts." The grim reality of their situation, however, could not be ignored. The dead outside were a pressing concern. Ethan, despite his wound, knew they couldn't leave them. "We need to deal with them," he said, gesturing vaguely towards the door. "Can't leave 'em for the buzzards and the coyotes to pick apart right on our doorstep. And the water. We need to move 'em clear of any seepage." It was a gruesome task, one that would have sent the Clara of Redemption Gulch into fits of horrified revulsion. But this Clara, the woman who had faced down Blackwood's guns and tasted her own desperate courage, merely nodded, her jaw set. She helped Ethan, her stomach churning, but her resolve firm, to drag the bodies a short distance from the shack, covering them with a shallow cairn of rocks. Each one was a stark reminder of the price of their freedom. They salvaged what they could from the fallen attackers: a couple of pistols with some ammunition, a serviceable knife, a half-empty canteen. Inside the shack, their own supplies were pitifully low: a few handfuls of dried beans, a little jerky, and not much else. The future, beyond the immediate relief of survival, was a vast, uncertain territory. Later that night, perhaps the second or third since the battle, a fragile sense of peace had begun to settle over them. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by a profound exhaustion that was almost a comfort. Ethan had managed to build a small, controlled fire in the shack's crude stone hearth, its flickering light pushing back the oppressive darkness, its warmth a small comfort against the chill desert night that had descended upon the canyon. Outside, the wind still howled its lonely song, a constant reminder of the harsh, indifferent world that lay beyond their temporary sanctuary. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the flames dance. Clara, noticing the way Ethan's gaze would often drift into the fire, a deep, unutterable sadness clouding his eyes, finally broke the quiet. Her voice was soft, tentative. "Ethan, those scars you carry, they're not all on the outside, are they? There's a hurt in you, a deep one. I see it sometimes, when you think no one's looking." Ethan was silent for so long that Clara thought he hadn't heard, or wouldn't answer. He stared into the fire, the flames reflecting in his haunted eyes. Then, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of a lifetime of sorrow, he began to speak. His voice was low, at times barely a whisper, and raw with a pain that time had clearly not healed. He told her then everything, not just the veiled illusions he'd offered before, but the whole, unvarnished, agonizing truth about Sarah Cole, his wife, and Emily, their little girl. He spoke of their life in a small, verdant valley far to the north, a life filled with simple joys, hard work, and a love that had been his anchor, his sun, his moon. He painted a picture of a paradise lost, a life stolen by a man named Governor Harrison, a man whose greed and cruelty were a mirror image of Silas Blackwood's. Harrison, a land baron who coveted their fertile valley, had used his power, his wealth, and a corrupted legal system to systematically strip them of everything. False debts, trumped-up charges, hired thugs who harassed and intimidated. The final day, he recounted, his voice cracking, was seared into his memory like a brand. Harrison's men come to evict them, to seize the last of their meager belongings. Sarah, his fiery, proud Sarah, had refused to bow. She'd stood her ground, defending her home, her child, her dignity, with the courage of a lioness, and they had cut her down, brutally, savagely, before his very eyes, while he, bound and helpless, had been forced to watch. Little Emily, he choked on the name, had been taken. He'd escaped later, a madman consumed by grief and a desperate, all-consuming need for vengeance, for rescue. He'd tracked them for weeks, months, following a cold, fading trail, fueled by a sliver of hope that had eventually withered and died. He'd never found Emily, only whispers, rumors of her fate, each one more horrifying than the last. The not knowing, he confessed, was a torment worse than any certainty. Tears, hot and unashamed, traced paths through the dust and grime on his weathered face as he spoke, the agony of his loss as fresh, as raw, as if it had happened only yesterday. I've been a ghost ever since. Clara, he finished, his voice thick with unshed grief, running, not from them, not anymore, running from myself, from the guilt, the knowing that I wasn't there for them, not in the way that mattered, that I couldn't protect them. He looked at his hands, calloused and scarred. I figured I didn't deserve to live. Not really. Not after that. Didn't deserve to feel anything good ever again. Clara listened, her heart aching for him, for the immensity of his loss. She didn't offer empty platitudes, no hollow words of comfort. She knew, from her own far lesser but still profound experiences, that some wounds never truly healed. When he finally fell silent, the only sound, the crackling of the fire and his ragged breathing, she reached out, her small hand covering his larger, trembling one where it rested on his knee. It was a simple gesture, an offering of shared humanity, of understanding that transcended words. No one, she said softly, her voice filled with a fierce, compassionate empathy. No one should ever have to endure such things. Ethan, what they did, it was an abomination. She paused, gathering her thoughts. You can't blame yourself for the evil that men like Harrison, like Blackwood, unleash on the world. You fought for them then. I know you did. And you fought for me. You showed me that even when the darkness seems absolute, there's still a choice to fight back, a choice to live. She shared, then, briefly, her own feelings of betrayal by her father, the crushing weight of being deemed worthless, a commodity, the suffocating despair of facing Blackwood's cruelty alone. A long, comfortable silence settled between them. The shared pain, a strange, unexpected bridge. Later, as the fire burned low, Clara looked at Ethan, her gaze clear and thoughtful. You said once that helping me, it might be a second chance for you. After all this, Ethan, have you found it? Ethan met her gaze, a slow, rare smile touching his lips, a smile that seemed to chase some of the shadows from his eyes. I think I'm starting to. Clara, he admitted, his voice quiet. It's not about changing what happened. Can't nobody do that? But maybe it's about building something new, something I can stand by, something that lets me look myself in the mirror again without wanting to smash it. And you helped me see that path. Clara, you truly did. A new resolve, a powerful sense of self, had been kindled in Clara, too. She had faced death, had taken life, had been stripped bare, and had found an inner strength she never knew she possessed. I won't be Clara Hayes anymore, she declared, her voice resonating with a newfound confidence. A quiet but unshakable determination. Daughter of Josiah Hayes, the man who sold me for a bottle and a few silver dollars. And I sure as hell will never be anything belonging to Silas Blackwood. No one gets to own me, Ethan. No one gets to name me or decide my fate ever again. She looked at him, a spark of defiance in her eyes. From now on, I'm just Clara. Clara, free to choose my own way, my own life. Ethan looked at the young woman before him, no longer a frightened girl, but a survivor, a warrior, reborn in the fires of adversity. He saw not fragility, but an immense, resilient strength. He nodded slowly, a profound respect in his gaze. Clara, he said, his voice warm, sincere. It's a fine name, and it's yours, all yours. Nobody can ever take that away from you now.